When people hear the word Atlantis, most minds immediately jump to images of a lost city deep beneath the ocean, shining temples buried under dark waves, and forgotten technology far beyond its time. Some imagine crystal towers beneath the Atlantic. Others picture an advanced civilization destroyed in a single terrible night. For more than 2,000 years, Atlantis has lived somewhere between history and myth, between philosophy and obsession. Entire expeditions have searched for it. Empires have claimed descent from it. Scholars have dismissed it, while dreamers have refused to let it die. But the strange truth is this: Atlantis begins with only one man. Not with sailors, not with archaeologists, not with explorers, with a philosopher. Around 360 BC, in the city of Athens, inside the quiet stone halls of Plato's academy, one of the greatest thinkers in human history sat writing dialogues about politics, morality, the nature of the universe, and the ideal state. Plato was not writing adventure stories. He was building systems of thought. He wanted to understand how a perfect society should function, why civilizations rise and collapse, and what happens when power grows faster than wisdom. And somewhere inside that philosophical mission, he gave the world Atlantis. The story appears in only two of his works: the dialogue known as Timaeus and the unfinished dialogue Critias. These two texts are the only original ancient source for Atlantis. There is no earlier complete record. No Egyptian scroll has ever been found. No Greek historian before Plato wrote about it. Everything begins here. That fact alone has fueled debate for centuries. Was Plato recording genuine ancient history? Or was he creating the most powerful political allegory ever written? To understand why Atlantis became immortal, we have to go back to the way Plato introduces it. He does not simply say, "Here is a story." Instead, he builds a chain of memory designed to make it feel ancient, distant, and real. The speaker in the dialogue is Critias, a respected Athenian statesman and philosopher, a man based on Plato's own great-grandfather. Critias tells the listeners that this story did not come from him. He says he heard it as a child from his grandfather, who had heard it from his own father, who had heard it from the great lawgiver Solon. And Solon was no ordinary name. In ancient Greece, Solon was legendary. He was one of the 7 sages of Greece, the man credited with laying the foundations of Athenian democracy. His wisdom was unquestioned. By attaching Atlantis to Solon, Plato was not choosing a random source. He was giving the story maximum authority. According to Critias, Solon traveled to Egypt around 590 BC, visiting the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Egypt, even then, was already ancient beyond imagination. While Greek civilization was still relatively young, Egyptian temples had stood for thousands of years. Their priests were seen as guardians of forgotten knowledge, keepers of records stretching back beyond the memory of Greece itself. It was there inside the temple archives of Sais that Solon supposedly heard the story. The priests welcomed him, and as they discussed history, Solon began speaking proudly of Athens, its heroes, its myths, its great age. But the Egyptian priests interrupted him with a statement that must have stunned him. They told him, Solon, you Greeks are always children. Not because Greeks lacked intelligence, but because they lacked ancient memory. The priests explained that Greece had suffered repeated destructions through floods, fires, and catastrophes that erased its past. Egypt, protected by the Nile and spared from many of these disasters, had preserved records stretching back through immense spans of time. And in those records, they said, was the story of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's own time. A mighty island empire, a civilization so powerful it ruled over vast lands and threatened the entire known world. A kingdom called Atlantis. The priest described it as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient Greek name for the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic Ocean. To the Greeks, this was the edge of the known world. Beyond those pillars was mystery, danger, the endless western sea, and somewhere out there, according to the priests, there had once existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. That phrase alone became one of the most discussed lines in history. Larger than Libya and Asia combined. In Plato's time, Libya referred not to the modern country alone, but to much of North Africa west of Egypt. Asia referred mainly to Asia Minor, modern Turkey, not the full continent as we understand it today. Even so, Plato was describing something enormous. Not a city, not a small island, a massive power, Atlantis, and it was not isolated. It was the center of an empire. From Atlantis, rulers controlled many other islands and parts of the mainland. Their influence stretched into Europe and Africa. They were wealthy, ambitious, and militarily unmatched. Their fleets dominated the seas. And eventually, they turned their eyes toward the Mediterranean, toward Greece, toward Athens. But before war came, Plato gives something far more powerful, a description. And this is where Atlantis stopped being philosophy and became obsession. Because Plato did not describe Atlantis like a vague legend. He described it like a city map. Specific, measured, detailed, almost architectural. At the heart of Atlantis stood its capital, one of the most visually unforgettable places ever written. According to Plato, the original center of the city was created by Poseidon himself. The god of the sea had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on a small hill near the center of the island. To protect her, Poseidon shaped the land into alternating rings of sea and land, great concentric circles surrounding the central island like ripples frozen in stone. This became the foundation of Atlantis, a city built in circles. Imagine standing above it from the sky. At the very center, a sacred island. Around it, a ring of water, then a ring of land, then another ring of water, then another ring of land. Again and again. Perfect geometry. Defense built into beauty. Nature and engineering combined. These rings were connected by bridges and tunnels, allowing ships to pass from the outer sea all the way into the heart of the city. Plato even gives dimensions. The central island measured about 50 stadia across, roughly 5 to 6 miles in diameter. This was no mythic blur. It was a design. When people hear the word Atlantis, most minds immediately jump to images of a lost city deep beneath the ocean, shining temples buried under dark waves, and forgotten technology far beyond its time. Some imagine crystal towers beneath the Atlantic. Others picture an advanced civilization destroyed in a single terrible night. For more than 2,000 years, Atlantis has lived somewhere between history and myth, between philosophy and obsession. Entire expeditions have searched for it. Empires have claimed descent from it. Scholars have dismissed it, while dreamers have refused to let it die. But the strange truth is this. Atlantis begins with only one man. Not with sailors. Not with archaeologists. Not with explorers. With a philosopher. Around 360 BC, in the city of Athens, inside the quiet stone halls of Plato's Academy, one of the greatest thinkers in human history sat writing dialogues about politics, morality, the nature of the universe, and the ideal state. Plato was not writing adventure stories. He was building systems of thought. He wanted to understand how a perfect society should function, why civilizations rise and collapse, and what happens when power grows faster than wisdom. And somewhere inside that philosophical mission, he gave the world Atlantis. The story appears in only 2 of his works, the dialogue known as Timaeus and the unfinished dialogue Critias. These 2 texts are the only original ancient source for Atlantis. There is no earlier complete record. No Egyptian scroll has ever been found. No Greek historian before Plato wrote about it. Everything begins here. That fact alone has fueled debate for centuries. Was Plato recording genuine ancient history? Or was he creating the most powerful political allegory ever written? To understand why Atlantis became immortal, we have to go back to the way Plato introduces it. He does not simply say, "Here is a story." Instead, he builds a chain of memory designed to make it feel ancient, distant, and real. The speaker in the dialogue is Critias, a respected Athenian statesman and philosopher, a man based on Plato's own great-grandfather. Critias tells the listeners that this story did not come from him. He says he heard it as a child from his grandfather, who had heard it from his own father, who had heard it from the great lawgiver Solon. And Solon was no ordinary name. In ancient Greece, Solon was legendary. He was one of the 7 sages of Greece, the man credited with laying the foundations of Athenian democracy. His wisdom was unquestioned. By attaching Atlantis to Solon, Plato was not choosing a random source. He was giving the story maximum authority. According to Critias, Solon traveled to Egypt around 590 BC, visiting the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Egypt, even then, was already ancient beyond imagination. While Greek civilization was still relatively young, Egyptian temples had stood for thousands of years. Their priests were seen as guardians of forgotten knowledge, keepers of records stretching back beyond the memory of Greece itself. It was there inside the temple archives of Sais that Solon supposedly heard the story. The priests welcomed him, and as they discussed history, Solon began speaking proudly of Athens, its heroes, its myths, its great age. But the Egyptian priests interrupted him with a statement that must have stunned him. They told him, Solon, you Greeks are always children. Not because Greeks lacked intelligence, but because they lacked ancient memory. The priests explained that Greece had suffered repeated destructions through floods, fires, and catastrophes that erased its past. Egypt, protected by the Nile and spared from many of these disasters, had preserved records stretching back through immense spans of time. And in those records, they said, was the story of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's own time. A mighty island empire, a civilization so powerful it ruled over vast lands and threatened the entire known world. A kingdom called Atlantis. The priests described it as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient Greek name for the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic Ocean. To the Greeks, this was the edge of the known world. Beyond those pillars was mystery, danger, the endless western sea, and somewhere out there, according to the priests, there had once existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. That phrase alone became one of the most discussed lines in history. Larger than Libya and Asia combined. In Plato's time, Libya referred not to the modern country alone, but to much of North Africa west of Egypt. Asia referred mainly to Asia Minor, modern Turkey, not the full continent as we understand it today. Even so, Plato was describing something enormous. Not a city, not a small island, a massive power, Atlantis, and it was not isolated. It was the center of an empire. From Atlantis, rulers controlled many other islands and parts of the mainland. Their influence stretched into Europe and Africa. They were wealthy, ambitious, and militarily unmatched. Their fleets dominated the seas. And eventually, they turned their eyes toward the Mediterranean, toward Greece, toward Athens. But before war came, Plato gives something far more powerful, a description. And this is where Atlantis stopped being philosophy and became obsession. Because Plato did not describe Atlantis like a vague legend. He described it like a city map. Specific, measured, detailed, almost architectural. At the heart of Atlantis stood its capital, one of the most visually unforgettable places ever written. According to Plato, the original center of the city was created by Poseidon himself. The god of the sea had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lived on a small hill near the center of the island. To protect her, Poseidon shaped the land into alternating rings of sea and land, great concentric circles surrounding the central island like ripples frozen in stone. This became the foundation of Atlantis, a city built in circles. Imagine standing above it from the sky. At the very center, a sacred island. Around it, a ring of water, then a ring of land, then another ring of water, then another ring of land. Again and again. Perfect geometry. Defense built into beauty. Nature and engineering combined. These rings were connected by bridges and tunnels, allowing ships to pass from the outer sea all the way into the heart of the city. Plato even gives dimensions. The central island measured about 50 stadia across, roughly 5 to 6 miles in diameter. This was no mythic blur. It was a design metropolis. The outermost ring of water served as a giant harbor, filled with ships from across the world. Merchant vessels crowded the docks. Warships stood ready. Trade flowed constantly. The city was alive with movement, wealth, and noise. And surrounding each ring were massive walls. Not ordinary stone walls. Walls covered in metal. The outer wall was coated in brass, the next in tin, and the innermost wall, the most sacred, was covered in orichalcum. This mysterious metal became one of Atlantis' greatest mysteries. Plato says orichalcum was second in value only to gold. Its exact identity remains unknown. Some believe it referred to a kind of bronze. Others think it was a legendary alloy. Some later writers treated it almost like a lost supernatural metal. Whatever it was, Plato wanted one thing clear: Atlantis gleamed. The walls reflected sunlight like fire. Ships approaching from the sea would see a city shining on the horizon like something built by gods. At the very center stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. This temple was colossal, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, and proportionally tall enough to dominate the skyline. Its walls were covered in silver, except for the pinnacles, which blazed with gold. Inside stood one of the most dramatic images in all of ancient literature, a giant golden statue of Poseidon himself, standing in a chariot, driving 6 winged horses. Not normal horses. Winged horses. Divine horses. The statue was so enormous it nearly touched the ceiling. Around him stood 100 nereids riding dolphins, and surrounding them were statues of the 10 original kings of Atlantis and their queens, all cast in gold. This was not just religion. It was dynastic power displayed in metal. Every visitor entering that temple would understand one message. This civilization believed itself chosen by the gods. And perhaps more than that, they believed they ruled by divine right. The island itself was astonishingly fertile. Plato describes vast plains, perfectly rectangular, stretching for hundreds of miles, bordered by mountains and open to the sea. These plains produced enormous harvests, enough to feed a population of extraordinary size. The Atlanteans harvested twice each year. Winter rains nourished one crop. Summer irrigation supported another. And that irrigation system was one of the most advanced details in Plato's account. A great canal, 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, stretched from the capital to the sea for more than 1,000 miles. Smaller canals branched from it in a perfect grid across the plains. These were not just for farming. They were transportation routes. Goods moved through them. People traveled through them. The land itself had been engineered. Everything about Atlantis suggested planning, scale, and ambition. Its mountains provided timber for shipbuilding and construction. Its fields produced grain, fruits, and vegetables in abundance. Its forests supported wildlife. Its mines yielded gold, silver, copper, and the mysterious orichalcum. Even elephants, Plato says, lived there, used as one more symbol of the island's overwhelming natural wealth. This abundance created military power, and Plato gives military numbers so enormous they still shock readers. Atlantis could field 60,000 military leaders, 120,000 heavy infantry, 180,000 archers, another 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone throwers and javelin men, 240,000 horsemen, 60,000 chariots, and a navy of 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. That is a military force of more than 1 million soldiers. In the ancient world, this was almost unimaginable. These were not just numbers. They were warning. Plato wanted Atlantis to feel overwhelming. An empire so vast that resisting it seemed impossible. And yet one small force stood against it. Ancient Athens. This is where the story becomes more than geography. Because Plato was not just describing a lost island. He was creating a mirror. On one side stood Atlantis, rich, powerful, technologically advanced, militarily unstoppable. On the other stood ancient Athens, not the Athens of Plato's own day, but an idealized version of it. Virtuous, disciplined, just, a perfect state. According to the Egyptian priests, Atlantis launched a campaign of conquest, seeking to dominate the Mediterranean world. One by one, lands fell under its control, until only Athens stood against it. And somehow, against impossible odds, Athens defeated Atlantis. Not because it was stronger, because it was better, because virtue defeated corruption, because discipline defeated greed, because justice defeated ambition. This is where many historians begin to suspect Plato's real purpose. Because the story sounds less like lost history and more like philosophy in dramatic form. But before that final destruction comes something even more important. The moral decline. Plato says Atlantis was not always corrupt. In the beginning, the Atlanteans were noble. They were descendants of Poseidon. They governed wisely. They respected law. They valued justice more than wealth. Their divine blood made them balanced, rational, and virtuous. Their society functioned because everyone fulfilled their proper role. Kings ruled wisely. Warriors defended honorably. Citizens lived with moderation. It resembled the ideal state Plato described elsewhere in his philosophy. But generations passed, and something changed. The divine blood became diluted. The descendants of Poseidon married ordinary mortals. Little by little, the godlike part of their nature weakened. And as it weakened, greed entered. Luxury replaced discipline. Power replaced wisdom. Ambition replaced justice. The people of Atlantis became obsessed with wealth, conquest, and domination. They stopped ruling themselves. They began ruling for themselves. And this, Plato says, was the true beginning of their destruction. Not the earthquake, not the flood. Moral collapse came first. The physical destruction only followed what had already happened in the soul. This idea sits at the heart of everything. Civilizations do not die first from outside attack. They die from inside, from arrogance, from excess, from forgetting what made them strong. For Plato, Atlantis was not merely a place. It was a warning. And then came the end. Zeus, seeing the corruption of Atlantis, decided judgment was necessary. The gods gathered. Divine punishment approached. And then Plato's dialogue, Critias, breaks off. Abruptly. Incomplete. Mid-story. The final speech is missing. We never get Plato's own full description of Zeus's judgment. But elsewhere, the priest's account provides the result. In a single day and night of terrible misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. Earthquakes, floods, violence from the earth itself. The island sank. Its armies vanished. Its cities disappeared. Its harbors were lost forever. And the ocean where it had stood became impassable, choked with mud and shoals left behind by the catastrophe. A civilization larger than empires. Gone. In one night. No survivors. No return. Only memory. And perhaps not even memory. Only Plato. That is how Atlantis entered human imagination. Not through ruins. Not through discovery. But through a philosophical dialogue in Athens. A story told by a philosopher through a politician, through a grandfather, through Solon, through Egyptian priests, through temple records, reaching back 9,000 years. A chain so long it feels like myth, and yet so detailed it feels like history. That tension is exactly why Atlantis never died. Because from the very beginning, people asked the same question we still ask now. Did Plato invent it? Or was he preserving something real? That question would divide philosophers, historians, explorers, emperors, and dreamers for the next 2,000 years. And the first person to challenge Atlantis was not a modern skeptic. It was Plato's own greatest student, Aristotle. The moment Plato died in 347 BC, he left behind more than philosophical ideas. He left behind questions that would outlive empires. Among them was Atlantis, a story so vivid that people could not simply ignore it, yet so strange that they could not easily accept it. And the very first battle over Atlantis did not happen in modern times with archaeologists and divers. It happened inside the intellectual world of ancient Greece itself, among the men who had studied directly under Plato. The most important of them all was Aristotle. If Plato was the architect of ideal forms, Aristotle was the builder of systems. Where Plato loved allegory, myth, and philosophical storytelling, Aristotle demanded categories, observation, and evidence. He was younger, sharper in method, and far less patient with ideas that could not survive examination. He had spent nearly 20 years inside Plato's academy, learning from the master himself. But over time, he moved in a very different direction. And when it came to Atlantis, Aristotle was not impressed. A famous statement preserved in later writings captures his position with brutal simplicity. He reportedly said, "The man who invented it also destroyed it." In other words, Plato created Atlantis, and Plato sank it. For Aristotle, this was not merely a disagreement over geography. It was a deeper criticism of method. He believed Plato had used a fictional framework to teach philosophical lessons, and that later readers were making the mistake of treating the story as literal history. Aristotle was not attacking the usefulness of the story. He understood the moral lesson perfectly, but he rejected the idea that it should be read as a real lost civilization. That short dismissal became the earliest known scholarly skepticism about Atlantis. And it mattered because Aristotle was not just another student. He would become one of the most influential thinkers in human history. His views shaped science, politics, logic, and philosophy for nearly 2,000 years. If Aristotle believed Atlantis was invented, generations of scholars would take that judgment seriously. His rejection reflected a larger divide between him and Plato. Plato often used myths to reveal truth. The myth of air, the cave, Atlantis. These were stories designed to illuminate ideas that pure logic alone could not fully express. Plato believed narrative could sometimes carry philosophical truth more powerfully than argument. Aristotle distrusted that approach. He wanted direct reasoning. He wanted observable evidence. He wanted things that could be tested against the world. And Atlantis, with its enormous island larger than continents, its divine bloodlines, and its sudden destruction in a single night, looked far more like a philosophical construction than a reliable historical report, especially because no one else seemed to know about it. That silence was a problem. If Atlantis had truly existed as a world-threatening empire, why did no major Greek historian mention it? Take Herodotus, for example. Writing in the 5th century BC, before Plato, Herodotus was obsessed with distant lands, strange customs, and forgotten histories. He traveled widely, listened to local traditions, questioned priests, and wrote enormous accounts of Egypt, Persia, Scythia, and places far beyond Greece. He loved stories of vanished peoples and ancient disasters. If Egyptian priests were preserving records of Atlantis, Herodotus was exactly the kind of man who should have heard about it. Yet he says nothing, not a word. No giant island beyond Gibraltar. No ancient war between Athens and a Western empire. No civilization swallowed by the sea. For later critics, that silence became deafening. Then there was Thucydides. Unlike Herodotus, Thucydides was not interested in wonder. He was severe, analytical, almost modern in his standards. His history of the Peloponnesian War focused on causes, evidence, and political realism. He was an Athenian deeply concerned with his city's past and its identity. If Athens had once saved the world from a massive Atlantean invasion, Thucydides would have had every reason to mention it. He did not. Again, silence. This absence troubled ancient readers as much as it troubles modern ones. Because if Plato's Atlantis came from genuine old records known to Egyptian priests and transmitted through Solon, why had nobody else ever written about it? Why did it exist only inside Plato? This is one reason so many scholars, even in antiquity, suspected invention. But not everyone agreed with Aristotle. Some of Plato's followers defended Atlantis passionately. One of the earliest was Crantor of Soli, a philosopher of the early 3rd century BC and one of the first major commentators on Plato's Timaeus. Crantor believed Atlantis was not merely symbolic. He argued that Plato had indeed based the story on genuine Egyptian records. Fragments of his work survive through later writers, and according to those fragments, Crantor even claimed he had personally verified the existence of inscriptions in Egyptian temples that supported Plato's account. Whether this was true, exaggerated, or misunderstood remains impossible to know. The original records do not survive. We only know of the claim because later authors repeated it. But the fact that someone so close to Plato's intellectual world defended Atlantis as historical shows how divided the debate already was. Even in the ancient world, there were two camps. One said Atlantis was allegory. The other said Atlantis was memory. And both sides had powerful reasons. As centuries passed, geography itself became part of the argument. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing during the age of Augustus in the early Roman Empire, approached Atlantis with a practical mind. Strabo was one of the greatest geographers of antiquity. He studied lands, distances, coastlines, and reports from explorers. By his time, Mediterranean knowledge of the Atlantic had expanded far beyond Plato's era. Sailors had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules. They had explored western coasts. The Atlantic was no longer pure mystery, and Strabo was deeply skeptical. He questioned the sheer size Plato described. An island larger than Libya and Asia combined seemed absurd given known geography. He also criticized the idea that the sea beyond Gibraltar had become unnavigable because of mud left by Atlantis' destruction. Contemporary sailors were navigating Atlantic waters just fine. There was no vast muddy barrier, no obvious sign of a drowned continent. To Strabo, this looked like literary invention, not physical reality. His criticism mattered because it shifted the debate from philosophy to geography. Now Atlantis was not just a question of Plato's intent. It was a question of maps. Where exactly could such a place fit? If it existed, where was it? And if it did not exist, why describe it with such precision? Roman historians faced the same puzzle. Livy, who wrote monumental histories of Rome and often incorporated Greek traditions, never treated Atlantis as real history. Tacitus, known for his sharp political insight and attention to geography, also ignored it. Roman intellectuals admired Plato, borrowed his political theories, discussed his philosophy, but Atlantis never became part of accepted Roman historical tradition. That silence says something important. The Romans loved grand origin stories. They connected themselves to Troy, to heroes, to gods. If Atlantis had been widely accepted as genuine ancient history, Roman writers would likely have used it. Instead, most treated it as philosophical literature. Yet the story refused to disappear, because even when scholars doubted it, the imagery was too powerful to forget. A lost civilization, a perfect city, morale corruption, divine destruction. People could reject the facts and still be haunted by the idea. And then something changed. In late antiquity, a new philosophical movement rose that transformed how people read Plato. It was called Neoplatonism, beginning in the 3rd century AD and reaching full strength by the 5th. Neoplatonism treated Plato almost like sacred scripture. Philosophers such as Plotinus, Iamblichus, and later Proclus believed Plato's dialogues contained layers of hidden truth. Every myth, every image, every story had deeper metaphysical meaning. Atlantis was no longer just a historical question. It became a cosmic symbol. The most important figure here was Proclus, writing around the 5th century AD. His commentary on the Timaeus is one of the most detailed, surviving ancient discussions of Atlantis. Unlike Aristotle, Proclus refused to choose between history and symbolism. He said it was both. He argued that Atlantis described real events, but also carried profound allegorical meaning. For Proclus, The Egyptian priests were trustworthy because the Egyptian religious tradition preserved ancient wisdom through unbroken continuity. Their temple records represented genuine access to the deep past. Plato was not inventing. He was transmitting sacred history. But Proclus also saw another layer. In his interpretation, Atlantis symbolized the material world, wealth, ambition, physical power, the seductive beauty of temporary things. Ancient Athens symbolized the higher life of reason, philosophy, and spiritual order. The war between them was not only political, it was eternal. It was the struggle inside every human being. Mind against appetite, discipline against desire, truth against illusion. Atlantis falls because material glory cannot last. Its destruction becomes a spiritual lesson. This interpretation allowed later readers to preserve the dignity of Plato's narrative without requiring strict historical proof. Even if no one found Atlantis, the story remained true in a deeper sense. And this idea proved extremely powerful, because once a story becomes symbolic, it becomes almost impossible to kill. Critics can attack facts. They cannot easily destroy meaning. Then Christianity entered the conversation. As the Roman world became Christian, scholars had to decide what to do with pagan philosophy. Plato was too important to ignore, but not everything in Greek thought fit neatly into Christian theology. Atlantis created a problem. Plato dated it to roughly 9,000 years before Solon, around 9,500 BC. That was far older than many biblical chronologies allowed. If the Bible's timeline placed creation only a few thousand years before Christ, where exactly did Atlantis fit? Christian thinkers responded in different ways. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, took a surprisingly flexible approach. He respected Greek philosophy and tried to harmonize it with Christian teaching. Rather than rejecting Atlantis outright, he suggested the Egyptian chronology behind Plato's story might be exaggerated or misunderstood. Egyptian systems of counting years were complicated, and perhaps Plato or Solon had interpreted them incorrectly. In this view, Atlantis could still refer to real events, just not quite as ancient as Plato claimed. Augustine of Hippo was more cautious. In The City of God, Augustine acknowledged the philosophical greatness of Plato, but remained skeptical of specific historical claims that lacked scriptural grounding. He was willing to appreciate Atlantis as moral teaching without committing to its literal truth. And for Christian readers, the destruction of Atlantis fit perfectly into one powerful theme: divine judgment. A rich civilization grows proud. It abandons virtue. It worships power and pleasure. Then catastrophe comes. This sounded very familiar. Babylon, Sodom, the flood. The moral pattern matched biblical history, even if the location did not. So Atlantis survived again, not as accepted history, but as a warning. A civilization judged for its own corruption. Theological meaning kept it alive. Yet the practical problem remained. Texts. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, libraries disappeared, trade networks broke apart, and Europe entered centuries of fragmentation. Manuscripts became rare and precious. Monasteries preserved what they could, but copying books was slow, expensive, and selective. And Plato suffered badly. Much of his complete work vanished from Western Europe. Fragments remained. References survived. But the full dialogues containing Atlantis, especially Critias, became difficult or impossible for most medieval scholars to access. A strange silence followed. For centuries, Europe remembered Plato as a great philosopher without actually reading much of Plato himself. And Atlantis, trapped inside, missing manuscripts, faded into the shadows. It did not disappear completely. Its echo survived through summaries, through Neoplatonic commentary, through scattered references. But the full vivid city, the shining walls, the rings of water, the temple of Poseidon, largely vanished from ordinary intellectual life. Europe entered the Middle Ages dreaming of lost kingdoms, hidden islands, and drowned lands, but often without direct access to Atlantis itself. The legend had not died. It had gone asleep, and when it returned, it would arrive in a world transformed. A world of printing presses, of rediscovered Greek texts, of ships crossing oceans, of entirely new continents rising on the western horizon. Because when Atlantis came back, Europe was no longer looking only at old maps. It was discovering that the world itself was far larger than anyone had imagined. For nearly 1,000 years, Atlantis lived like a ghost in Europe, half remembered, rarely read, surviving more as a rumor inside the reputation of Plato than as a fully known story. Scholars knew Plato mattered. They quoted his philosophy, argued over his ideas, and treated his name with enormous respect. But most of them had never actually seen the complete dialogues that contained Atlantis. The vivid world of concentric rings, golden temples, giant fleets, and a continent swallowed by the sea had been buried not under the Atlantic, but under centuries of lost manuscripts. Then the Renaissance arrived, and with it came one of the greatest recoveries of knowledge in human history. Europe began turning backward in order to move forward. Scholars searched monasteries, old libraries, forgotten collections, and distant cities for the original texts of the ancient world. Greek learning, which had dimmed in much of Western Europe, returned with force. Humanists believed wisdom had been scattered across time like broken statues, and their job was to gather the pieces. Then came one event that accelerated everything: the fall of Constantinople in 1453. When the Ottoman Empire captured the great Byzantine capital, Greek scholars fled westward, carrying with them precious manuscripts, works that had survived for centuries in Eastern libraries. Among them were texts of Plato that Western Europe had not properly possessed for generations. This was not just a literary event. It changed intellectual history. Suddenly, Europe could read Plato directly again. And among those rediscovered works were the Timaeus and Critias. Atlantis returned. One of the most important men in this revival was Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine philosopher and translator working under the patronage of the powerful Medici family. Ficino was not simply translating words. He believed Plato contained spiritual truth, ancient wisdom that could stand beside Christianity rather than against it. He saw himself as reopening a sacred conversation between antiquity and the present. Around 1484, Ficino completed his monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works. For the first time in nearly a millennium, educated Europeans across the West could read Atlantis in full. And what they found was irresistible. The story did not feel like a medieval legend. It felt strangely modern. It had measurements, engineering, politics, military statistics, constitutional systems, urban planning. It did not read like pure mythology. It read like the memory of a civilization. Ficino himself approached Atlantis through the lens of Neoplatonism. Like Proclus before him, he believed the story carried moral and spiritual meaning beyond literal history. He focused on the rise and fall of a people who began in virtue and ended in greed. Atlantis, to him, was a lesson about civilization itself. A society can become rich and powerful. That is not enough. Without moral discipline, greatness destroys itself. This message resonated deeply in Renaissance Italy, where wealthy city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan balanced brilliance and corruption side by side. Public magnificence and political intrigue lived together. Plato's Atlantis did not feel distant. It felt familiar. At the Medici court, surrounded by bankers, artists, scholars, and political ambition, Atlantis became more than an ancient story. It became a mirror for power. And then history delivered something extraordinary. In 1492, only a few years after Plato's complete works became widely available, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The timing could not have been more dramatic. Europe had just recovered the full story of a lost island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And now ships were sailing west beyond the Pillars of Hercules and discovering lands no classical map had properly described. For many people, the connection felt almost unavoidable. Had Plato been talking about the New World? Had Atlantis been America? This question exploded across Europe. because suddenly the Atlantic was no longer just mystery. It was geography, real geography. The old edge of the world had been crossed, and on the other side stood entire civilizations. Not empty wilderness. Empires, cities, monuments, wealth. The discovery of the Aztec Empire especially shocked Europe. When Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, he found something many Europeans could barely believe. A vast city built on an island in a lake, connected to the mainland by great causeways, filled with canals, markets, temples, and complex urban planning. To readers who knew Plato, the resemblance felt uncanny. An island capital, waterways everywhere, sophisticated engineering, monumental architecture, enormous wealth. It did not prove Atlantis, but it ignited imagination. Some began to wonder if the Egyptians had preserved distant memories of American civilizations, and Plato had transformed those memories into Atlantis. One of the first major writers to make this argument openly was Francisco López de Gomara in his Historia General de las Indias, published in 1552. López de Gomara argued that the advanced civilizations discovered in the Americas showed that Plato's account should not be dismissed so quickly. Europeans had once assumed no great civilization could exist across the Atlantic. Now they knew otherwise. The very existence of the Aztecs and other American peoples made Plato seem less impossible. His argument was simple but powerful. If advanced empires existed in lands unknown to the Greeks, why could there not have been even older ones before them? Atlantis no longer seemed absurd. It seemed plausible. Even the location matched. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. The Americas were beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. He described a land vast in size. The Americas were vast beyond imagination. He described a civilization rich in resources, metals, agriculture, and monumental construction. The Spanish were reporting exactly such things. Of course, the match was far from perfect. Plato's concentric capital and exact chronology did not align neatly with known American history. But once imagination begins, precision becomes less important than possibility. Another important figure, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, spent years documenting the New World and also noted similarities between Platonic descriptions and American realities. He wrote about indigenous engineering, water systems, architecture, and social complexity in ways that fed Atlantis speculation. Particularly striking were the hydraulic systems. Plato had described Atlantis as a civilization shaped by water, harbors, canals, irrigation, tunnels, engineered plains. And in the Americas, Europeans found astonishing examples of exactly that kind of thinking. Tenochtitlan's canals allowed movement by boat throughout the city. Its causeways and water controls showed advanced urban planning. In the Andes, irrigation systems supported entire civilizations in difficult landscapes. These were not primitive societies waiting for Europe. They were highly organized worlds. To Renaissance readers, this mattered enormously, because Atlantis was never just about a place. It was about the possibility that history was older, stranger, and grander than they had been taught. The discovery of America proved one thing beyond argument. The ancient world had not known everything. If the Greeks could be wrong about geography, perhaps they had also forgotten history. Perhaps Plato was preserving memory rather than fantasy. This idea gained further support from missionary scholars like José de Acosta, whose Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590, tried to understand how the Americas fit into world history. Acosta was careful and more restrained than the bold Atlantis theorists, but he still explored the possibility that ancient migrations and forgotten civilizations connected the old world and the new. He believed the Americas had been populated through ancient movements of people from Asia or elsewhere, and while he did not claim Plato had perfectly described them, he accepted that old traditions might preserve distorted memories of real events. This created a middle ground. Maybe Atlantis was not literally the Aztec Empire. Maybe it was an older memory transformed across centuries. Maybe Plato received fragments of truth wrapped in myth. This theory became attractive because it solved several problems at once. It allowed people to respect Plato. It acknowledged real discoveries. And it avoided demanding exact one-to-one proof. But one major problem remained impossible to ignore. Time. Plato placed Atlantis around 9,000 years before Solon, roughly 9,500 BC. That was extremely difficult. Most Renaissance scholars still worked within biblical chronologies that place creation only a few thousand years before Christ. Archbishop Ussher's famous calculation would later date creation to 4004 BC. But even before that, Christian scholars generally believe human history was far younger than Plato's timeline required. So how could Atlantis exist before Adam? It could not. At least not within standard Christian chronology. This forced scholars into creative solutions. Some argued Plato had misunderstood Egyptian dating systems. Perhaps Egyptian priests counted months as years, which would reduce 9,000 years to something closer to 750 actual years. Others suggested symbolic numbers had been mistaken for literal chronology. Some believed oral tradition had exaggerated the age of the events over centuries. And others simply accepted that Egyptian records might preserve a pre-biblical civilization whose place in sacred history was unclear. No solution satisfied everyone. But the dating problem did not kill Atlantis. It simply made it more mysterious. The linguistic side added even more fuel. Early European scholars often believed they found similarities between indigenous American languages and ancient Old World tongues. These comparisons were usually weak and often mistaken, but in the 16th century, they felt significant. If words seemed related, perhaps peoples were related. If peoples were related, perhaps histories were connected. And if histories were connected, perhaps Atlantis had been part of that forgotten bridge. Today we know most of those linguistic theories were flawed, but at the time they seemed like evidence. And evidence was exactly what Atlantis believers wanted. Then came the printing press. This mattered more than people often realize. Before printing, a strange theory might live inside a few private manuscripts. After printing, it could spread across Europe. Ficino's translations circulated widely. Editions of Plato appeared in Venice, Paris, Basel, and beyond. Scholars from England to Prague could read the same passages and argue over the same lines. Atlantis became international. No longer just a philosophical footnote in Greek texts, it became a subject of serious debate among historians, theologians, geographers, and explorers. The question changed. It was no longer simply, did Plato invent this? Now it became, if Atlantis was real, where exactly was it? Spain looked west. Italy looked to classical wisdom. Some looked toward the Atlantic islands. Others toward North Africa. Still others imagined Atlantis had been destroyed so completely that only scattered memories remained. And beneath all of it was a deeper emotional force. The Renaissance loved lost greatness. It was an age obsessed with ruins, broken statues, fallen impious, forgotten wisdom. Atlantis was the perfect symbol, a civilization so magnificent that it vanished entirely. It fit the Renaissance imagination perfectly. The same people restoring Roman marble and reading Greek manuscripts were naturally drawn to the idea that the greatest civilization of all might still be waiting somewhere beneath the sea. But as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, Europe itself began to change again. The scientific revolution was rising. Observation began replacing authority. Maps became sharper. Evidence became harder. People wanted proof. And Atlantis was about to enter a far more dangerous world. The world of science. Because once philosophers stop asking what a story means, and scientists begin asking where it is on a map, the mystery becomes much harder to protect. And soon, one man in the frozen north would make perhaps the boldest claim of all. He would not place Atlantis in America. He would not place it beneath the Atlantic. He would say Atlantis had been there all along. In Sweden, by the 17th century, Atlantis had crossed a dangerous line. It was no longer just a philosophical story, no longer only a moral warning from Plato or a symbolic lesson about pride and collapse. It had become a geographical problem. People wanted coordinates. They wanted coastlines. They wanted proof. The age of exploration had changed everything. Europeans had crossed oceans, mapped continents, and discovered civilizations the ancient Greeks never knew existed. The world had become larger, but also more measurable. Mystery was no longer enough. If Atlantis had truly existed, then scholars believed it should leave traces in maps, ruins, languages, bones, or at the very least in geography itself. And so the question changed again. Not was Atlantis real, but where was it? Among all the strange answers that followed, one of the boldest came not from the Mediterranean, not from the Atlantic Islands, and not from the New World, but from the cold north. From Sweden. The man behind it was Olaus Rudbeck, one of the most ambitious and controversial scholars of the 17th century. Rudbeck was no eccentric outsider shouting strange theories from the margins. He was a respected academic, a professor of medicine at Uppsala University, a scientist, an anatomist, and a man of enormous intellectual confidence. He had already made major contributions to anatomy and natural science. But history remembers him most for one astonishing claim. Sweden was Atlantis, not a symbolic Atlantis, not a poetic one, the real Atlantis. His massive work, Atlantica, published in 4 huge volumes between 1679 and 1702, attempted to prove exactly that. It was one of the most extraordinary scholarly projects of its age. Rudbeck believed that the ancient world had misunderstood its own geography. According to him, Plato's description had been read incorrectly for centuries. Atlantis had never been somewhere lost in the Atlantic Ocean. It had been in Scandinavia all along. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, but to understand why Rudbeck believed it, we have to understand the world he lived in. 17th century Sweden was not a quiet northern kingdom. It was an empire. Under kings like Charles X and Charles XI, Sweden had become one of the dominant powers of northern Europe. It controlled large parts of the Baltic region and projected military power far beyond what people now associate with Sweden. National pride was enormous, and like many rising powers, Sweden wanted not only political greatness, but historical greatness. Empires like ancient Rome had glorious origin stories. Why shouldn't Sweden? Rudbeck offered one. He argued that Sweden was not just another kingdom. It was the birthplace of civilization itself. According to him, the original Atlantis, described by Plato, was ancient Sweden, and from Sweden the foundations of world civilization had spread southward into Greece, Rome, and beyond. This was not merely historical theory. It was national mythology disguised as scholarship. But Rudbeck built it with impressive seriousness. His first argument was linguistic. He claimed the word Atlantis itself could be traced to ancient northern names connected to Swedish lands. Through complicated etymological reasoning, he argued that Atlantis was related to Atland, an old designation he associated with Scandinavian territory. He argued that many Greek and Latin words themselves had roots in ancient Swedish language. In his view, the classical Mediterranean world was not the parent civilization. It was the child. Sweden came first. Greek culture inherited from the north. This reversal was radical. Instead of civilization flowing from south to north, Rudbeck imagined it flowing from north to south. His second argument was geography. Plato described Atlantis as a land of water, rings, harbors, channels, navigable routes. Rudbeck looked at Sweden and saw exactly that. The eastern coast of Sweden, with its archipelagos of islands, narrow waterways, sheltered harbors, and intricate maritime routes, seemed to him like a northern reflection of Plato's circular island kingdom. He pointed to the Baltic Sea, the Great Lakes of Scandinavia, and the navigable river systems that connected regions together. Perhaps, he argued, later scholars had simply assumed the wrong sea. Maybe the Pillars of Hercules did not refer to Gibraltar at all. Maybe they referred to some northern passage near Denmark or the Baltic entrance. If the geographical reference changed, everything changed. Suddenly, Atlantis did not have to be in the Atlantic Ocean. It could be in the Baltic world. His third argument came from archaeology, or at least what archaeology looked like in the 17th century. Across Sweden stood large Bronze Age burial mounds, ancient graves filled with impressive objects, weapons, jewelry, metalwork, signs of wealth and distant trade. These sites suggested to Rudbeck the remains of a once magnificent civilization. He looked at burial mounds and saw Atlantean kings. He looked at ancient metalwork and saw Plato's lost wealth. He looked at imported objects from faraway lands and saw proof of imperial trade networks. It was a grand reconstruction built from fragments. And for many Swedes, it was irresistible, because it gave them more than history. It gave them destiny. If Sweden had once been Atlantis, then modern Swedish greatness was not accidental. It was a restoration of ancient glory. Rudbeck's theory became deeply tied to national identity. But outside Sweden, skepticism was strong. One of the greatest minds of the age, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, admired Rudbeck's intelligence, but doubted his conclusions. Leibniz understood the danger of overusing etymology. If one allows enough freedom with language, almost any word can be connected to any other word. He recognized that Rudbeck's method could prove too much, and therefore prove nothing. The problem was not ambition. It was discipline. Rudbeck's evidence was built on interpretation stacked upon interpretation. If one assumption failed, the whole structure weakened. And slowly, that is what happened. As linguistic methods became stricter and archaeology more careful, his Swedish Atlantis became harder to defend. But even as scholars criticized Rudbeck, his work did something important. It made Atlantis a serious subject of national scholarship. He showed that people were willing to treat Plato not as literature, but as a historical puzzle worthy of enormous academic effort. That mattered, because once scholars begin trying to prove Atlantis scientifically, the conversation changes forever. At the same time, other thinkers were looking not north, but back to the Atlantic itself. French geographers and natural philosophers became increasingly interested in the possibility that Atlantis had once been a real landmass in the ocean between Europe and America. One important figure here was Philippe Boitsch. In the 18th century, Boitsch approached Atlantis not through mythology, but through physical geography. He asked a simple question: what if Plato was describing land that had actually sunk? By this time, knowledge of ocean depths and coastlines had improved dramatically. Scholars were beginning to understand that the Earth itself changed over immense spans of time. Mountains rose, seas shifted, shorelines moved. Marine fossils found high in mountains showed something undeniable. Places now dry had once been underwater, and places underwater may once have been dry. This idea transformed Atlantis theory. No longer did people need divine punishment alone to explain a vanished continent. They could appeal to geology. Earth itself was unstable. Boitsch proposed that ancient land masses might once have existed in the North Atlantic, later submerged through geological change. He created maps showing hypothetical underwater plateaus and island chains between Europe and North America. These were not fantasies of mermaids and crystal temples. They were attempts to use scientific mapping to ask whether Plato's story might preserve distant geological memory. His maps imagined Atlantis not necessarily as a single giant island exactly matching Plato, but as a real prehistoric Atlantic land system that later disappeared. This was important because it made Atlantis feel compatible with science rather than opposed to it. Instead of asking whether Poseidon built rings of water, scholars asked whether sea levels after the Ice Age had drowned coastal civilizations. That question was far more reasonable, and in some ways, it remains alive even today. Because after the last Ice Age, sea levels really did rise dramatically. Entire coastlines disappeared. Ancient human settlements were flooded. The difference is scale. A drowned coastal culture is one thing. A continent-spanning super-civilization is another. But in the 18th century, the line between those possibilities was still blurry. At the same time, The Enlightenment was producing its own fierce critics. Thinkers like Voltaire approached Atlantis with sharp skepticism. Voltaire had little patience for grand historical fantasies built on weak evidence. He respected reason above inherited authority and loved exposing the absurdities hidden inside accepted stories. For him, Atlantis looked suspicious from the start. Why did only Plato mention it? Why were there no independent Egyptian records? Why did the dates make no sense? Why did the island vanish so perfectly that nothing remained except a philosopher's dialogue? Voltaire did not see mystery. He saw literary construction. He treated Atlantis as a brilliant invention, a moral story mistaken for history by readers too eager for wonder. And the Enlightenment increasingly favored his side. The new standards of scholarship were ruthless. Source criticism became stronger. Historians compared texts carefully. Claims required corroboration. Ancient authority alone was no longer enough. This was the age of evidence, and Atlantis was weak on evidence. Edward Gibbon, writing the monumental The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, represented this new seriousness. Historical claims had to survive comparison, contradiction, and scrutiny. A single isolated source was dangerous. A beautiful story was not proof. Under these standards, Atlantis struggled badly. It had one source, one author, one philosophical context that looked less like preserved history and more like designed allegory. Yet the mystery refused to die, because geography itself kept tempting belief. The great Pacific voyages of James Cook and others revealed something remarkable. Advanced societies could exist on islands scattered across enormous oceans. Polynesian civilizations showed extraordinary navigation, social complexity, and cultural sophistication across distances Europeans had once considered impossible. This mattered. It reminded scholars that ancient people were capable of far more than earlier generations assumed. Maybe Plato's island empire was not impossible after all, but there was a difference. In the Pacific, explorers found real remains, real people, real structures, real continuity. In the Atlantic, Atlantis remained invisible. No ruins, no inscriptions, no clear archaeological footprint, only speculation. German scholars of the 18th century also approached Atlantis through broader studies of mythology and ancient civilization. They compared biblical chronology, Near Eastern traditions, and classical myths, trying to understand how stories of floods, lost lands, and vanished peoples might preserve fragments of real memory. Because Atlantis was not the only flood story. Mesopotamia had one. The Bible had one. Greek myths had several. Many cultures remember destruction by water. Was Atlantis just another version of humanity's oldest fear? Or was it something specific hidden inside a universal pattern? That question grew stronger as archaeology itself began changing. Toward the late 18th century, scholars were no longer satisfied with texts alone. They wanted the ground to speak. Excavation became more systematic. Ancient cities were uncovered. Artifacts were cataloged. Civilizations once dismissed as legend, like Troy, would eventually be dug from the earth. And that changed everything. Because once Troy could be real, people asked, why not Atlantis? Perhaps Plato had done what Homer had done. Perhaps beneath exaggeration lay truth. Perhaps myth was memory wearing dramatic clothing. The problem was simple. Troy had a place. Atlantis did not. And until someone could find that place, belief would always remain unstable. Still, the 19th century was approaching, and with it came an age that loved grand theories more than any before. Empire, evolution, hidden races, lost continents, ancient wisdom, all would collide. Atlantis was about to leave the libraries of philosophers and enter something far larger. Popular obsession. And once that happened, the search would become far stranger than Plato could ever have imagined. By the 19th century, Atlantis was no longer just a problem for philosophers, priests, or careful historians. It escaped the academy. It escaped the libraries. It moved into newspapers, public lectures, drawing rooms, adventure books, occult societies, and the imagination of ordinary people. Something had changed in the modern world. People were no longer satisfied with the known map of history. The Industrial Revolution had transformed life so quickly that the past itself began to feel unstable. Railways crossed continents, telegraphs connected nations, empires expanded across oceans, and science was rewriting the age of the Earth. Suddenly, human civilization looked both young and ancient at the same time. And in that world, Atlantis became irresistible, because Atlantis offered everything at once. Ancient greatness, catastrophique destruction, lost wisdom, a mystery that seemed just close enough to be real. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a missing chapter of human history. If found, Atlantis would not simply be another ruin. It would rewrite civilization itself. One of the most important turning points came through geology. By the 19th century, scientists had fully accepted that Earth was vastly older than earlier biblical chronologies allowed. Mountains, fossils, glaciers, and sediment layers all pointed toward immense stretches of time. Human history no longer had to fit inside a few thousand years. This mattered enormously for Atlantis. Plato's date, roughly 9,500 BC, had once been a major obstacle because it clashed with Christian chronology. Now suddenly it seemed possible. Not proven, but possible. And alongside this came a scientific idea that would deeply influence Atlantis theories: lost continents. Before modern plate tectonics explained continental movement, many scientists tried to explain strange patterns in biology and geology by proposing vanished land bridges and submerged continents. Why were similar plants and animals found on distant continents, separated by oceans? How did certain ancient species appear in places now disconnected? This idea produced famous hypothetical lost lands like Lemuria in the Indian Ocean and Mu in the Pacific. And if such continents could exist in theory, Atlantis no longer sounded like fantasy. It sounded geological. Maybe Plato had remembered a real, prehistoric landmass swallowed by natural catastrophe. This possibility exploded in public imagination. Then came the man who turned Atlantis from scholarly debate into international sensation, Ignatius L. Donnelly. If Plato created Atlantis, Donnelly reinvented it for the modern world. In 1882, he published a book with a title that said everything: Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book became enormously influential. It reached far beyond academic circles and shaped Atlantis theories for generations. Donnelly was not a fringe mystic speaking in shadows. He was a former U.S. congressman, a lawyer, a serious public intellectual. His writing was confident, organized, and persuasive. He presented Atlantis not as speculation, but almost as a solved historical problem. His argument was bold. Atlantis had been a real advanced civilization in the Atlantic Ocean before the biblical flood, and it was the true mother civilization of the ancient world. Egypt, inherited from Atlantis. The Maya, influenced by Atlantis. The pyramids, Atlantean legacy. Flood myths across cultures, memories of Atlantis' destruction. Even shared symbols, myths, and architectural similarities across distant civilizations were, for Donnelly, proof of a common Atlantean source. He believed Atlantis explained everything. This was the power of his theory. It turned scattered mysteries into one grand answer. Why do pyramids appear in Egypt and Mesoamerica? Atlantis. Why do flood myths exist worldwide? Atlantis. Why do ancient cultures share strange, symbolic similarities? Atlantis. Why do civilizations seem to emerge suddenly? Because they inherited from Atlantis. Today, historians reject most of Donnelly's conclusions because they relied heavily on superficial similarities rather than rigorous evidence. Similar shapes do not prove direct connection. Human societies can independently invent similar solutions to similar problems. But Donnelly wrote at the perfect moment. The public wanted grand explanations, and he gave them one. He described Atlantis as a technologically advanced, morally fallen civilization destroyed by catastrophe, whose survivors spread across the world carrying fragments of lost knowledge. This transformed Atlantis from a Platonic story into a global origin theory, and it made the legend far bigger than Plato. Donnelly's Atlantis was not just a city. It was the missing parent of civilization. His book sold widely and inspired countless later writers. Even people who never read Plato often absorbed Atlantis through Donnelly's version instead. In many ways, the Atlantis most people imagine today, an advanced prehistoric civilization with secret wisdom and global influence, comes more from Donnelly than from Plato. And once Atlantis entered popular imagination like that, it attracted something else: the occult. The late 19th century was an age of spiritual experimentation. Alongside scientific progress came fascination with hidden knowledge, ancient mysteries, seances, esoteric religions, and secret wisdom traditions. Many people believe modern science explains matter, but not the soul. Atlantis became perfect material for that hunger. One of the most influential figures here was Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky did not treat Atlantis as a historical puzzle alone. She made it part of a vast spiritual cosmology involving hidden masters, ancient wisdom, and successive root races of humanity. In her works, especially The Secret Doctrine, Atlantis became the homeland of one of these great prehistoric races. The Atlanteans were no longer just an island civilization. They were a stage in cosmic human evolution. According to Blavatsky, Atlantis had possessed advanced spiritual and psychic knowledge, but its people became corrupted by materialism and misuse of power, leading to their destruction. Notice how closely this still echoes Plato. Wes, corruption, d'une folle. Only now the language had changed. Philosophy became a cult cosmology, and the effects were enormous. Through theosophy, Atlantis entered spiritual movements across Europe and America. It became connected not only to history, but to reincarnation, hidden powers, and secret ancient masters. From there, things grew stranger. Some later occult writers claimed survivors of Atlantis founded Egypt. Others said Atlanteans had psychic crystals, advanced energy systems, even technologies lost to modern civilization. None of this exists in Plato. But once Atlantis became symbolic enough, imagination had no limit. This also introduced one of the darker chapters in Atlantis history: racial mythology. Some 19th and early 20th century thinkers tried to use Atlantis to explain racial hierarchies, claiming certain modern peoples were descendants of superior Atlantean bloodlines. These theories were deeply flawed, pseudoscientific, and often tied to colonial arrogance and racist ideology. Atlantis became a tool for people trying to give mythological justification to political prejudice. This would become especially dangerous in the 20th century. But even before that, archaeology itself was creating new shocks. In 1870, Heinrich Schliemann announced discoveries at Troy. For centuries, many educated people had treated Homer's Troy as mostly legendary. Then Schliemann dug into the earth and found a real ancient city. Suddenly, myth looked different. If Troy could be real, why not Atlantis? This comparison became one of the strongest emotional arguments for believers. Schliemann himself became entangled in Atlantis speculation, though many later claims about him finding Atlantis evidence were exaggerated or false. Still, the symbolism mattered. Ancient literature could preserve truth beneath exaggeration. The line between myth and history became unstable. Then Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos in Crete and revealed the lost Minoan civilization. This was another major moment. The Minoans were sophisticated, maritime, wealthy, and had suffered catastrophic destruction linked partly to the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini. Suddenly, scholars had a real ancient civilization with some features that seemed vaguely Atlantean. An island power, advanced architecture, naval strength, sudden collapse. Some began wondering whether Plato had transformed distant cultural memory of the Minoans into Atlantis. This theory would grow much stronger later, because unlike the giant lost continent theories, it had something precious: actual ruins. But 19th century public imagination preferred bigger things. People wanted grand continents, not careful historical parallels. And Atlantis gave them grandeur. Adventure fiction embraced it. Newspapers speculated about it. Writers imagined submarine ruins and forgotten kings. Even as professional historians grew more cautious, the public became more fascinated. Atlantis had crossed into modern myth. And myths, once they enter popular culture, become almost impossible to control. At the same time, scientists were becoming stricter. Geology advanced. Oceanography improved. The Atlantic seabed was studied more seriously. And one uncomfortable fact became clearer. There was no obvious sunken continent. No giant drowned landmass where Plato seemed to place Atlantis. This did not end belief, but it forced theories to evolve. Atlantis had to move. Maybe it was not the mid-Atlantic after all. Maybe it was the Mediterranean. Maybe it was the Caribbean. Maybe Antarctica. Maybe the Sahara. Maybe the North Sea. Atlantis became mobile. People searched everywhere. And that flexibility was both strength and weakness. Strength, because the mystery could survive any failed location. Weakness, because if Atlantis can be anywhere, it becomes harder to prove it is anywhere. Still, by the end of the 19th century, one thing was certain. Atlantis was no longer owned by Plato. It belonged to the modern world. To scientists. To dreamers. To occultists. To nationalists. To novelists. To treasure hunters. Everyone wanted something from Atlantis. Proof. Wonder. Authority. Meaning. And the 20th century would make all of that even more intense. Because the next era would bring world wars, underwater archaeology, sonar mapping, and the rise of mass media. For the first time, humanity would have the tools to search beneath the sea itself. And people would ask the old question with new urgency. What if the ruins were still down there waiting? The 20th century changed Atlantis forever. For thousands of years, people had argued with words. Texts, philosophy, rumors, maps, speculation. But now, for the first time in history, humanity had machines powerful enough to search beneath the sea itself. Ships carried sonar. Divers reached deeper than ever before. Archaeology became scientific. Aerial surveys changed how ruins were found. Entire lost cities were uncovered from desert sands and ocean floors. And with every discovery, the old dream returned stronger. What if Atlantis was not just a story? What if it was still there, waiting, buried underwater, covered by mud, silent since Plato? This possibility captured the modern imagination like almost nothing else. Because the 20th century was the age of hidden worlds. Tutankhamun's tomb was opened. Machu Picchu became internationally famous. The ruins of Troy, Knossos, and Mycenae reshaped ancient history. Pompeii emerged like a city frozen in time. It felt as if the earth itself was giving back secrets. Why not Atlantis too? At the same time, popular culture exploded. Radio, cinema, mass newspapers, later television. Ideas spread faster than ever before. Atlantis was no longer just for scholars reading Plato. It became part of movies, pulp fiction, documentaries, conspiracy theories, and adventure stories. The lost city beneath the sea became one of the most powerful modern myths on Earth. But while popular imagination grew wilder, professional archaeology became more careful. And that created tension. Because real archaeology rarely looks like legend. It looks like broken pottery, stone foundations, trade records, carbon dating, slow, frustrating evidence, not shining crystal towers, not impossible machines, not giant golden doors under the Atlantic. This is where Atlantis believers and professional historians often split apart. Archaeologists asked, what can be proven? Believers asked, what if proof is still hidden? And between those two questions, the battle continued. One of the most important developments came through the excavation of the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. This theory would become one of the strongest serious academic attempts to explain Atlantis. Not as a lost continent, not as a supernatural civilization, but as distorted memory of a real Bronze Age disaster. The Minoans were first brought into modern focus by Arthur Evans, who began excavating the Palace of Knossos in the early 20th century. What he found stunned Europe. A highly advanced civilization had flourished on Crete long before classical Greece. They built large palaces. They had complex writing systems, sophisticated art, international trade, naval power, and unlike the war-centered image of later Greece, Minoan civilization seemed elegant, wealthy, and deeply maritime. This mattered immediately because Plato's Atlantis was also a powerful island civilization dominating the sea. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Then came the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini. In the 2nd millennium BC, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history exploded there. The eruption was catastrophic. Ash darkened skies across the region. Massive tsunamis struck surrounding coasts. Trade systems collapsed. Entire settlements were buried. The nearby Minoan world suffered enormous damage. For many scholars, this sounded familiar. A wélte maritime civilisation. A sudden natural catastrophe. Destruction by sea and earth. Memory preserved across generations. Could Plato's Atlantis be a greatly exaggerated memory of the Minoan collapse? This became known as the Minoan hypothesis. And unlike many Atlantis theories, it had real evidence. Real ruins. Real destruction. Real chronology. Not perfect chronology. Plato's dating was still far too early, but oral memory can distort time dramatically across centuries. Supporters argued that the basic shape fit. A powerful island civilization destroyed by natural disaster and remembered long afterward in transformed form. Even details like advanced water systems, monumental architecture, and naval dominance seemed to align. The Minoans did not have concentric rings of water like Plato described, but their island culture and sudden downfall gave historians something solid. A possible historical seed beneath the myth. This theory remains one of the most respected serious explanations today, not because it proves Atlantis, but because it offers something rare, a bridge between myth and history. Still, many problems remained. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond Gibraltar, in the Atlantic, not inside the Mediterranean. The Minoans were Mediterranean. Plato describes Atlantis as an enemy of ancient Athens thousands of years before known Athenian civilization. The Minoan collapse happened much later, and the scale of Plato's island is far larger than Crete or Santorini. So the theory solves some questions and creates others. But compared to lost continents in the Atlantic, it feels grounded, and that gave it lasting power. Meanwhile, outside serious archaeology, Atlantis theories became far more dramatic. In the early 20th century, psychic readings entered the story through Edgar Cayce, one of the most famous mystics in American history. Cayce claimed through trance readings that Atlantis had truly existed and that its people possessed advanced spiritual and technological knowledge. According to him, Atlanteans used powerful crystals for energy, flight, and communication, but destroyed themselves through misuse of that power. Again, the old Platonic pattern remained. Prosperity, corruption, destruction. Only now the language was modernized into psychic technology. Cayce even predicted that parts of Atlantis would rise again near Bimini in the Bahamas. This claim became famous decades later when unusual underwater stone formations were found there. The so-called Bimini Road, discovered in 1968, consists of large rectangular limestone blocks lying underwater. To believers, it looked like the remains of an ancient road, wall, or harbor. Proof. At last. To geologists, it looked like a natural beach rock formation shaped by natural processes. Probably not Atlantis. The debate became symbolic of the entire Atlantis question. One side saw a hidden civilization. The other saw ordinary geology. The stones themselves became less important than what people wanted them to mean. This pattern repeated everywhere. Every underwater structure, every strange ruin, every ancient flood story. Atlantis had become a lens through which people interpreted mystery. Then came one of the darkest distortions of Atlantis history. In parts of early 20th century Europe, especially within certain nationalist and occult circles, Atlantis was tied to racial mythology. Some writers claimed a superior ancient Aryan civilization had originated from Atlantis and that modern Northern Europeans were its descendants. These ideas were not scholarship. They were dangerous pseudoscience mixed with political ideology. Atlantis was twisted into propaganda. Some fringe thinkers connected these fantasies to nationalist movements and later to Nazi occult mythology, though popular modern stories often exaggerate how central Atlantis actually was to official Nazi ideology. Still, the connection existed enough to show how powerful myths can be manipulated. A lost civilization became a tool for modern prejudice. This was far from Plato's philosophical warning. It was myth used as weapon. At the same time, real ocean science was becoming harder to ignore. As submarine mapping improved, the Atlantic floor was studied in far greater detail. And the simple truth became increasingly clear. There was no missing continent. No giant, sunken landmass, matching Plato's description, sat in the middle of the Atlantic. Oceanic crust itself told the story. The seafloor there was geologically different from continental land. Atlantis, at least as a literal giant continent in the mid-Atlantic, became scientifically almost impossible. This was a major blow, but Atlantis survived by adapting. If not the Atlantic, then somewhere else. The Mediterranean, Spain, the Caribbean, Antarctica, the Black Sea. Even Antarctica became popular in fringe theories, especially after ancient maps were misunderstood as showing ice-free polar continents. Atlantis kept moving. It became almost impossible to falsify because every failed location simply created a new one. This frustrated serious historians. A theory that can survive any contradiction becomes difficult to treat scientifically. But for the public, flexibility kept the dream alive. Then underwater archaeology itself began producing real discoveries. Sunken ports, flooded settlements, ancient harbors, entire prehistoric coastlines drowned by rising seas. Places like Heracleon near Egypt and submerged Neolithic sites off Europe's coasts proved something important. The sea really does swallow cities. Not metaphorically, literally. This gave Atlantis new life. Even if Plato exaggerated, the idea of drowned civilization was not fantasy. It was archaeology. The end of the last ice age had raised sea levels dramatically. Coastal settlements from prehistoric times vanished beneath the ocean. Human memory of floods could absolutely survive. Suddenly Atlantis looked less like one impossible civilization and more like a symbolic memory of many real losses. Maybe there was no single Atlantis. Maybe Atlantis was the human memory of drowning itself. A civilization at the shore. The sea rising. Everything gone. This idea appealed to both scholars and dreamers because it preserved meaning without requiring impossible geography. And still, one stubborn fact remained. Plato. Everything came back to him because despite all discoveries, no Egyptian archive had appeared. No inscriptions saying Atlantis. No direct proof. Only Plato, which returned the oldest question once again. Did he invent it? Or did he preserve memory through philosophy? By the late 20th century, scholars had become more comfortable with a complicated answer. Perhaps both. Perhaps Plato used fragments of real disaster, Minoan collapse, flood memory, ancient political lessons, and shaped them into a philosophical masterpiece. Not pure fiction, not pure history, a crafted truth. But for the public, uncertainty was even better than proof. Because mystery survives where certainty ends. And Atlantis was never strongest as a solved puzzle. It was strongest as a question. A city we almost believe in. a civilization always just beyond reach. And as the 21st century approached, with satellites, deep-sea robotics, digital archaeology, and the internet spreading every theory instantly, the search would not end. It would become global, because now everyone could hunt for Atlantis, and everyone had their own map. By the beginning of the 21st century, Atlantis had entered a completely new phase of its existence. For the first time in history, humanity possessed tools powerful enough to map the ocean floor in detail, scan deep underwater terrain, and investigate submerged landscapes with precision that earlier generations could never have imagined. If Atlantis had been a physical continent in the Atlantic Ocean, this was the moment it should have finally appeared. Satellites mapped gravity anomalies across the oceans. Sonar systems traced underwater mountain ranges. Submersibles reached crushing depths. Digital elevation models reconstructed the seafloor with near-complete accuracy. And slowly, a clear picture emerged. The Atlantic Ocean floor is not a hidden continent waiting to be discovered. It is a geologically well-understood structure formed by tectonic plates spreading apart from the mid-Atlantic ridge. It contains mountain chains, volcanic formations, abyssal plains, and fracture zones, but no large missing landmass resembling Plato's Atlantis. This scientific reality created a quiet but decisive shift. Atlantis, if taken literally as a single sunken super-civilization in the Atlantic basin, became extremely unlikely. Not impossible in imagination, but unsupported by physical evidence. This did not destroy interest in Atlantis. Instead, it changed how serious researchers approached it. Rather than asking, "Where is Atlantis?" many scholars began asking a more grounded question. What real events could have inspired the story? This shift moved the discussion away from geography alone and toward history, archaeology, and cultural memory. One of the strongest modern approaches remains the connection to Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean, especially the Minoan world associated with Santorini and Crete. Archaeology has shown that around the 2nd millennium BC, a highly developed maritime civilization existed in the Aegean region. It had complex architecture, trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean, advanced artistic traditions, and sophisticated urban centers like Knossos. Then a massive volcanic eruption at Thera, modern Santorini, triggered earthquakes, tsunamis, and widespread disruption across the region. Many coastal settlements were destroyed or abandoned. Trade networks were damaged. Political systems shifted. Civilizations adapted. But the memory of sudden catastrophe likely remained in oral traditions for centuries. In this interpretation, Atlantis is not a literal Atlantic continent, but a transformed cultural memory of real Bronze Age collapse events, magnified, reshaped, and moved in space and time through storytelling traditions. This explanation is powerful because it fits several known facts. Ancient societies did experience catastrophic floods and volcanic disasters. Oral tradition can exaggerate scale and distance over centuries. Plato was writing more than 700 years after the supposed events. Many ancient cultures preserve idealized versions of historical memory. But even this theory does not fully resolve everything in Plato's account. The size of Atlantis, its location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and its detailed imperial structure still do not map cleanly onto any known civilization. This is where modern scholarship becomes careful. Most historians today treat Atlantis as a philosophical narrative grounded in possible historical inspirations, rather than a direct record of a single lost empire. In other words, Atlantis is understood less like a buried city waiting to be found, and more like a layered construction built from memory of natural disasters, knowledge of ancient civilizations, political philosophy, and moral storytelling. Plato's purpose, in this view, was not to provide geography, but to construct contrast. Ancient Athens idealized disciplined, rational, balanced. Atlantis, wealthy, expansive, powerful, and ultimately corrupted. The story functions as a warning about civilizational behavior. When power grows faster than wisdom, collapse becomes inevitable. That message is one of the reasons Atlantis never disappeared. Because even if the geography remains unproven, the pattern feels recognizable across history. Empires rise. They expand. They become wealthy. They become complex. And then they often face internal instability, external pressure, or sudden collapse. Atlantis, in this sense, became less about a place and more about a cycle. Modern researchers also point out something important about how myths survive. Atlantis persists not because of physical evidence, but because it solves a psychological and narrative need. It provides a missing origin point for lost knowledge, advanced civilizations, and unexplained cultural similarities. It offers a single story that can connect scattered mysteries into one unified idea. Human psychology is naturally drawn to that kind of explanation. A single lost civilization is easier to imagine than many unrelated developments across different regions. But archaeology consistently shows a more complex reality. Civilizations emerge independently in different parts of the world. Technologies develop through gradual innovation. Cultural similarities often arise through parallel problem solving rather than direct inheritance. Even so, Atlantis remains compelling because it exists at the intersection of three powerful forces: history, imagination, and uncertainty. And uncertainty is where it thrives most. Today, underwater archaeology continues to uncover real submerged sites, ancient settlements drowned by rising sea levels after the last ice age. These discoveries are scientifically important because they show that parts of human history truly are hidden beneath the sea. But none match the scale or description of Plato's Atlantis. Instead, what we find is something more grounded but still remarkable. Humans have always lived close to water, and water has always changed human history. Coastlines shift. Rivers change course. Sea levels rise and fall over millennia. Entire early settlements now lie underwater, waiting to be studied. This reality gives Atlantis a different kind of meaning, not as a single lost empire, but as a symbol of real vulnerability in early human civilization. The sea is not just a boundary. It is a force that reshapes history. And Plato, whether intentionally or not, captured that truth in dramatic form. That is why Atlantis has never fully disappeared from modern thought. It survives in documentaries, scientific debates, fiction, fringe theories, and serious academic discussion alike. It is too flexible to die completely, but also too unverified to become history. So it remains in between, a story always approaching discovery, never fully arriving. And perhaps that is the final reason Atlantis endures after more than 2,000 years. It represents something deeper than geography. It represents the human desire to believe that history is not complete, that something important is still missing, that beneath what we know, there's another layer waiting to be found. Plato gave a name, and the world has never stopped searching for it since. At this point in history, Atlantis stands in a very unusual position. It is no longer treated by mainstream archaeology as a lost physical civilization waiting to be discovered somewhere on Earth. After centuries of exploration, mapping, deep-sea surveys, geological analysis, and comparative archaeology, no evidence has ever been found of a single advanced continent-sized empire matching Plato's description in the Atlantic Ocean or anywhere else. That conclusion is not based on opinion or dismissal. It is based on absence of evidence across every major field that would be expected to reveal such a civilization if it had existed in the form Plato described. No ruins, no inscriptions, no widespread material culturelaire, no consistent geological trace of a sunken continent in the relevant time frame. Instead, what modern scholarship has built is a different understanding, one that does not require Atlantis to be physically real in order for it to be historically meaningful. Because when historians return to the original texts, something becomes increasingly clear. Plato was not writing like a historian documenting a known place. He He was writing like a philosopher constructing a controlled narrative. Everything in the Atlantis story is carefully designed to serve contrast. Two civilizations, two moral trajectories, two outcomes. On one side, ancient Athens is presented not as the Athens of Plato's own time, but as an idealized version of it, structured, disciplined, balanced, and aligned with justice. On the other side, Atlantis is structured as its opposite: wealth without restraint, expansion without limits, power without balance. And that contrast is the core of the story. Modern classical scholars generally interpret Atlantis as a philosophical construct built to illustrate Plato's political and ethical ideas in narrative form. In this reading, Atlantis is not a historical report that accidentally contains philosophy. It is philosophy expressed through historical style storytelling. That distinction is important, because Plato often used stories to communicate abstract ideas that would be difficult to express through pure argument alone. Myth, in his hands, was a teaching tool, a way to make invisible principles visible through imagined history. In that sense, Atlantis functions like a thought experiment on the scale of civilizations. It asks a question without stating it directly. What happens when a powerful society loses its internal balance? What happens when success outpaces wisdom? What happens when external strength replaces internal discipline? Plato answers that question through narrative collapse. Atlantis rises. It expands. It grows wealthy and dominant. Then it loses its moral structure, and eventually it disappears entirely. The result is not just destruction, it is erasure. A civilization that once dominated the imagination of the story is gone so completely that only a warning remains. That structure is what makes Atlantis so effective as philosophy. It is not just describing downfall, it is dramatizing inevitability. At the same time, modern historical research continues to explore whether Plato may have been influenced by real-world events that existed in cultural memory, even if they were not Atlantis itself. The most widely discussed candidate remains the Bronze Age Aegean world, especially the Minoan civilization and the catastrophic eruption of Thera near modern Santorini. This event did not create Atlantis, but it did create conditions that match several broad themes found in Plato's narrative. A prospero maritime civilisation, sudden natural disaster, collapse of regional power structures, long-term cultural memory of catastrophe. In this interpretation, Atlantis becomes a transformation of real ancient trauma into philosophical allegory. Not a copy of one event, but a synthesis of multiple historical impressions filtered through centuries of oral tradition, political symbolism, and intellectual design. However, even this carefully grounded explanation does not claim that Plato was attempting strict historical reconstruction. Most modern classicists emphasize that Plato's goal was not to preserve accurate geography or chronology. It was to construct a moral and political framework that would resonate with his audience in Athens. The Atlantis story appears immediately before or alongside discussions of ideal states, justice, and political organization. Its placement is not accidental. It functions as a narrative contrast point. And that is why Aristotle's early skepticism still matters. He recognized, very early, that Plato was not operating like a traditional historian. He was using narrative as philosophical architecture. Over time, that insight became dominant in academic interpretation. Today, Atlantis is generally classified in three overlapping categories: philosophical allegory, myth with possible historical inspiration, cultural narrative that evolved across centuries. What it is not, in the mainstream academic view, is a verified lost civilization. Yet removing Atlantis from literal history does not reduce its importance. If anything, it increases its influence. Because Atlantis has achieved something rare in human culture. It has outgrown its origin. It began as two dialogues written in ancient Athens. It passed through Egyptian priestly storytelling as described by Plato. It was debated by Greek philosophers like Aristotle. It was preserved and reinterpreted by Neoplatonists like Proclus. It was filtered through Christian chronology and medieval manuscript loss. It was revived by Renaissance translators like Marsilio Ficino. It was reimagined during the Age of Exploration after the discovery of the Americas by figures like Hernán Cortés. It was expanded into global civilization theories in the 19th century by writers like Ignatius L. Donnelly. It was spiritualized by theosophists like Helena Blavatsky. And it was tested against geology, archaeology, and oceanography in the modern scientific era. At every stage, Atlantis changed shape, but it never disappeared, because it is not just a claim about geography. It is a story about loss, memory, and human imagination. And that is why it survives even after the physical hypothesis has largely been rejected. Atlantis represents a pattern that appears again and again in human culture. The idea that something greater existed before us, was lost, and might still be recoverable. It is the longing for a deeper past that connects scattered fragments of history into a single narrative of disappearance and remembrance. In that sense, Atlantis is not located in the Atlantic Ocean. It is located in the human mind. It lives wherever people look at ruins and wonder what came before. Wherever civilizations rise and ask what was lost. Wherever history feels incomplete. And even today, with sonar mapping and satellite imaging covering nearly every corner of the planet's oceans, Atlantis continues to exist, not as a discovered place, but as an unresolved question. A story that refuses to close. A civilization that exists only in description, debate, and imagination. And perhaps that is why Plato's invention, whether intended as myth or lesson, has lasted longer than many real empires. Because empires disappear when their structures collapse. But ideas like Atlantis survive precisely because they are not bound to stone, soil, or sea. They are bound to curiosity. And as long as people continue to ask what lies beyond what is known, Atlantis will remain exactly where it has always been, just out of reach. Even after Atlantis fades from the world of philosophy and speculation, the deeper question it raised never really disappears. Because beneath all the arguments about Plato, geography, and lost continents, there's a more uncomfortable truth that history itself confirms. Civilizations really do disappear, not as myths, but as real, documented historical events. And to understand why Atlantis never stopped feeling possible, you have to look at a real moment in ancient history where the world did collapse in a way that still has no single agreed explanation. This is the world of the late Bronze Age collapse. Around the end of the 13th century BC, something extraordinary happened across the eastern Mediterranean. Civilizations that had stood for centuries began to fail almost simultaneously. Palaces burned. Trade networks broke apart. Writing systems disappeared in some regions. Cities were abandoned. And powerful kingdoms that once controlled vast regions suddenly fell into silence. Among these civilizations were the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and several coastal kingdoms in the Levant and Egypt's sphere of influence. These are not small societies. They were complex, interconnected systems of diplomacy, trade, warfare, and administration. And yet within a relatively short historical period, many of them collapsed or severely weakened. Egypt itself survived, but recorded invasions and disruptions that suggest a world under extreme pressure. Ancient inscriptions from this period describe mysterious groups, often referred to as sea peoples, moving across the Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities, and contributing to widespread instability. But even these records do not give a complete explanation. They describe symptoms, not causes. This is where modern archaeology and history step into one of their most challenging puzzles. What caused this widespread collapse? There is no single answer accepted by all scholars. Instead, there is a combination of possible factors that likely reinforced each other. Climate shift affecting agriculture. Earthquakes destabilizing cities. Internal political instability. disruption of trade networks, and large-scale migrations and conflicts across regions. In other words, not one catastrophe, but many pressures converging at once. A system that had become highly interconnected became fragile when multiple stress points failed simultaneously. And when that system collapsed, entire ways of life disappeared with it. Writing systems in some regions were lost for centuries. Administrative structures vanished. Urban centers were abandoned or reduced dramatically in size. Populations shifted. New societies eventually emerged, but the world they inherited was no longer the same world that had existed before. This is one of the most important realities of ancient history. Progress is not always continuous. Sometimes it breaks, and when it does, memory becomes fragmented. It is in this kind of environment that stories like Atlantis make sense, not as literal geography, but as echoes of cultural memory shaped by real patterns of collapse. A powerful civilization, a sudden breakdown, a world that changes so completely that the past feels larger than what came after. And this is where another real historical tradition begins to connect with the same idea. Long after the Bronze Age collapse, Greek oral memory preserved stories of a golden age that existed before the current world order. Not a single lost island, but multiple remembered pasts layered together. Early kings, ancient wars, lost civilizations, and distant ages where humanity was closer to the gods. These traditions appear in works like Hesiod's accounts of earlier ages of man, periods of decline from a former state of greater harmony. Again, the pattern is familiar. A movement from higher order to lower order, from stability to fragmentation, from clarity to confusion. Plato's Atlantis fits neatly into this broader cultural pattern of remembering the past as something more unified, more powerful, and more complete than the present. But unlike myth alone, archaeology confirms something crucial. The ancient world really did experience cycles of expansion and collapse. Cities rose and fell. Networks formed and broke. Entire regions could shift from prosperity to abandonment within generations. So while Atlantis as a single lost continent remains unproven, the emotional truth behind it, that civilizations can vanish or transform beyond recognition, is historically real. And that brings us to the final reflection that modern historians often make when studying stories like Atlantis. The danger is not in asking whether Atlantis existed. The danger is assuming that Atlantis must exist in a single fixed form in order for the story to matter. Because once we understand how fragile ancient civilizations actually were, the story changes shape again. Atlantis stops being a location. It stops being a mystery to solve, and it becomes something closer to a mirror, a reflection of how later cultures interpret collapse, memory, and the limits of human stability. Plato may have drawn from real historical impressions, philosophical reasoning, or purely constructed narrative. But what he created survived because it touches something consistent across human history. The awareness that what seems permanent is often temporary. That civilizations can reach extraordinary heights and still fall. That knowledge can be lost, and that memory is never perfect. This is why Atlantis continues